A lot of times customers can't tell you what they need, but they can certainly tell you what their challenges are. And it's up to you as a company to understand, like, okay, how do I connect myself with that challenge? How do I connect my messaging, my brand, my offering with the problem and potential solution that we can provide?
Do you really understand how your customers experience your product, website, app, or service? Janelle Estes would guess that while you probably think you do, you likely actually don't. Janelle is the Chief Insights Officer at UserTesting, a human insights company powering 50% of the top global brands. So what exactly does this human insights company do? UserTesting pairs companies up with real-life users who test the UI experience of apps, websites, and the like. The company prides itself on helping companies experience what their customers experience. Janelle joins the podcast to talk customer expectations, why business metrics don't always align with these expectations, and shares tips and tricks for companies looking to get honest, relevant, and applicable feedback on their UX. This is the insight you can only get right here on Marketing Trends. I'm your host, Jeremy Bergeron. I'm excited to take you on this ride. Now let's get into it. Before we dive into this conversation, I wanted to say thank you to our partners at Salesforce. We bring marketing and engagement together. Learn more at salesforce.com/marketing. Now let's get into it. So Janelle, first question. A lot of marketers, we've got a stat here, it says 72% of marketers say that meeting customer expectations is more difficult than it was a year plus ago. What are you seeing in the space, and what is kind of your team doing to tackle the consistent challenge of rising customer expectations?
I think the reality is that customer expectations continue to grow year over year. And with this shifting environment, with COVID, with work from home, with everybody being sort of, not connected in person, right? Everybody's sort of connecting with each other through this digital world. It's introduced this crazy acceleration of shifting customer demands and priorities. So if you think about sort of the trajectory of customer expectations, every year they grow, every year they shift and change a little bit. And it's kind of actually easier for companies to predict what those things are going to be and sort of, gather insight around, what are the shifting expectations and what should we do about it. It's almost like these things have become more predictable per se. However, when you introduce the last year or two and a complete seismic shift in how we work, how we engage with companies, how we engage with other people, it's nearly impossible to predict what those shifting expectations are. It's like we've built all these data models and ways to understand shifting customer behavior, and we're able to predict, right? Back in when things were more like quote unquote normal. But now when you introduce this totally different world, it's like none of those data models, none of that works anymore. You actually have to get out there and truly get ahead of what the customer expectations are and what the shifting demands are. So yeah, I'm not surprised by that statistic. 72% people or marketers saying it's in the last year, it's been hard to keep up with those shifting demands. And I think in terms of how we've been thinking about getting ahead of that, back to my comment around all of the data in the world can tell you kind of what's happening. But a lot of the data that we're collecting and the companies are collecting is what we call data exhaust. Like it's kind of, it's what happened, right? Versus how to predict the future. And to my original point, I think a big part of this, of being able to make that connection with your customers and truly understand what their expectations are and meet those needs, is to actually engage with them, to understand, to have one-on-one, human-to-human conversations about their world, how they're perceiving all the change, what their needs are. Sometimes customers, and actually a lot of times, customers can't tell you what they need, but they can certainly tell you what their challenges are. And it's up to you as a company to understand, like, okay, how do I connect myself with that challenge? How do I connect my messaging, my brand, my offering with the problem and potential solution that we can provide that's related to these new and I guess future looking opportunities, if you will.
That was a mic drop answer, Janelle. I really enjoyed that one. And you commented on this, how companies, a lot of brands have kind of over-indexed on the data and how important it is to get to the people behind the data, and how the past couple of years, like you said so eloquently, has accelerated that. And it's interesting now seeing some of these brands. We've had many of them, come on this show, of how they're now kind of having to, in some ways, kind of slow down to speed up again. Of like, wait, hold on a second. Like, we have to actually connect with our customers now. And oh, by the way, we have to do it really authentically. I feel like, and that doesn't seem to change, but it seems to get more and more important.
Yes, absolutely.
On this idea of, metrics, and again, is a large percentage. We have a stat here from Salesforce says 78% of marketing organizations have changed or reprioritized metrics due to the pandemic, due to the changes in the world. What has become the most valuable metric for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think many companies, look to the standard metrics that you look to when you're running a business, right? And you're trying to sort of be successful, right? It's about revenue, growth, cost savings and efficiency, profitability. The challenge with those metrics is that they are so business centric or company centric. It's all about you and the way you're performing. When the reality is you've got to sort of turn those metrics, it has to be more outside in. Many companies are driven from an inside out perspective. And when you're built that way and your teams are structured around those metrics, it's very easy to stay focused on yourself. And what happens is we start to lose sight of what our customers are trying to accomplish, what our customers need. We lose sight of delivering on what the customer expectations are. Back to the question we just talked about. There's a reason why there's a struggle around understanding people's and customers' expectations, is because we're not being deliberate about it. Most companies are not running their business truly around the customer. So when you ask me the metric, I see some metrics like CSAT and NPS and some of those that are sadly the ones that most companies kind of look to and track to try to understand, how is the customer experience being delivered. That being said, I feel like we could have an entire conversation around the NPS measure and maybe a separate episode about how it's a challenging way to gauge and understand your customer experience. But the reality is there's actually not a great replacement for that at the moment. And so the power behind NPS, however, is not just measuring it, which many, many companies do. I think nearly every company I engage with are looking at NPS at an executive level. They're doing sort of readouts at board meetings that capture how we performed last quarter versus this quarter versus our competition. The power behind NPS, though, is when you do notice your score in a place you don't like it, or you do notice that your competitors are outpacing you. That's where you start to build those true customer, you start to engage with customers on that human level, right? Understanding like what's going on, why is this happening? And most importantly, what's the action that we need to take to make a shift? So when you ask me about the metrics, I think certainly looking at more customer facing metrics that capture the actual customer experience should be right on par with the metrics that you're looking at as a business in terms of, the traditional revenue growth, profitability type measures.
That's great. Metrics that capture the customer experience. On that note, how can brands effectively connect with customers to determine whether or not these experiences are meeting the mark?
There are many ways to do it. It really does depend on the question that you're trying to answer. When I'm first working with companies that maybe are just starting on this journey, maybe this isn't a practice they've built into their muscle, or it's something that they're just starting to explore, I recommend they actually start with looking at what are the top 3 things, 5 things, 3 to 5 things that your customers need to be able to do when they engage with you. Whether that's finding information about your product or solution, whether that's actually going through and purchasing something and converting, or maybe it's support material or finding the nearest location. There are key things that your customers need to be able to do when they engage with you. And the idea is that you're looking at those and you're trying to understand, if I send 10 people through that experience and I watch what their experience is like, I can see essentially through their eyes and how they engage with me and what questions they have and what's easy to use and what's hard to use. If you're even just primarily focusing on those top key flows and you test them regularly, right? So user testing is a solution and it's the company that I work for, but there are also other ways to do this. But the idea is that you should be able to observe people, see the world through their eyes, and then that will help you understand what's working, what's not, and what you can do about it to make it better. It almost sounds like, well, no kidding. Like that doesn't sound like a super novel idea. Like, let me watch my customers use my experience, but you would be surprised how many companies and teams don't do it. And so when they're trying to improve their customer experience and ultimately improve how their business is performing, this is a key sort of weapon, if you will, in your arsenal of how you can go about approaching this in a way where you're able to make educated, smart decisions based on what you observe and how people interact with you.
What are maybe a couple of brands or any that you've seen and engaged with in the past, couple of years that are doing this right?
I have a couple to share. So the first one is more kind of an empathy-led organization. So if you've followed Microsoft, for example, over the years, Satya Nadella came on board and really pushed this mandate of empathy, and empathy not just in empathy to improve your personal life, but more empathy for your customers and understanding like what are the core unmet needs and opportunities that we can address. And I mean, I don't know if how much exposure you have to Microsoft products. If you all remember sort of what was the launch of one of their operating systems that didn't go so well. I mean, you're actually able to see the shift and the improvement of the actual experiences that Microsoft has delivered. Now, it hasn't been something that happened overnight. It's a progression over time, and it starts with sort of that executive kind of sponsor at the top, pushing teams to do this, making it part of their daily routines and patterns and behaviors. But, it certainly has paid dividends for them in terms of shifting that. Now, that is what I would consider to be a very sort of mature organization that is kind of really adopted this as part of what they do. Not every company is there. And so when you're starting kind of small, or again, you're just sort of starting on this journey. Another company that we've engaged with is AAA. So AAA, it's like over 100 years old, not a digital first company. I think I still pay my I have a AAA membership because my parents put me on it when I was in college, and I've just kept it. And I think it's the only bill that I actually still mail, like put a stamp on and mail in. So they had a part of their experience where they're trying to capture new customers. And the page that was sort of put in front of customers was very price driven. So it was 3 different subscription types, and they were just tiered by price. And underneath that, it had all the data and features and what was included. And, the team over there was really interested in trying to understand, like, how can we make this better for our customers and in turn increase the number of people that convert and choose to be customers. And so the team was traditionally tinkering with price. Like the whole hypothesis was like, oh, maybe the price point is like too high, or maybe it's too low and it's turning people off. Like, I don't know, there's a million reasons and why you could sort of hypothesize about why this wasn't performing. When the team actually put customers through the experience, they learned that when they were looking at a service like this, they were so not driven by price. They were actually driven more by safety, trust. If I'm, in a pinch, like, can I trust that you're going to show up? Can I trust that you're going to help me and resolve my situation? And it was a much more like emotional driven decision versus price conscious. If you can imagine like a typical optimization team, right? Or somebody who's looking at that page is probably going to be playing around with colors, price points, the design, right? Like which of the plans is going to try to pop up off the page to grab your attention. But the reality was that the team really went in and tried to understand, like, What are the emotional drivers? How are people actually making decisions about this? And then how can we pull those learnings back into the design? So that's exactly what they did. They created this page where they were presenting the 3 plans, but it was all driven by what the customer actually cared about. So really doubling down on the features around reliability and safety and trust. And secondarily, there was price. And they put these 2 pages out in an A/B test. And I don't know the exact statistics, but the long and short of it is that the page that was more driven around what the customer really cares about when they're making that decision, that one completely outperformed the price-driven one. And so, this is just an example of some of the power of doing this work.
Janelle, what are some best practices for phrasing, positioning questions to customers to avoid bias?
Just by way of understanding my background a little bit better, prior to being at UserTesting, I actually spent most of my career in the research space. So if you want to sometime talk about asking bias questions and best practices for how to structure research questions, I'm your gal. But the long and short of it is that you really have to think about how you're phrasing, right? And there are some like cardinal rules around asking people for feedback. But the most important tip I would give you is that when you put something in front of people, ask them to engage with it and don't try to lead them, right? So watch what they're drawn to naturally. Watch how they initially interact with a design or a message, or even capture, what is their facial reactions when they're reading something for the first time? Are they leaning in? Are they sitting back? Or do they look like they're drawn into the message or the experience, or do they seem overwhelmed? I mean, these are all subjective things that you have to sort of evaluate as you're observing. But I would say the big part is about not trying to shape the feedback that you're getting, right? You could plop somebody on a homepage and say, okay, so tell me what you think about the image on the homepage. And it's like, well, okay, that's helpful, but it might not be the first thing that people are drawn to. And so you're not naturally getting their sort of off the cuff feedback. Now, of course, you're going to have more pointed questions. And once you get into, more of the conversation, it's about making sure you broaden the question enough so you're not sort of prompting people for the answer that you're looking for, right? So, a question is, do you think this is easy to use? I mean, that's a question that when people are engaging with a digital experience, that's a key question they have. Or the other one is my favorite, is like, how likely are you to purchase this? Right. And it's like those types of questions, you're obviously going to get, yes, it is easy to use, or yeah, I think I would buy this. But the reality is that people, it's not anything, they're not being malicious or, there's no ill intent involved, but it's just the way that the mind works, right? It's, I'm going to answer the way that I, believe you want me to answer, type of thing. So when you are wanting to ask those types of questions, though, it's about keeping it much broader, right? So tell me about your experience using the website or app today. What was easy? What was hard? Keeping it broader instead of getting right in and asking, basically somebody a yes or no question. And actually, that's a really good tip, is to avoid yes or no questions in these conversations.
That's awesome. And again, it's like you're leading me right to the next question, which is around, gathering this feedback. Like how can companies, in 2022, gather feedback on experiences without sacrificing customer privacy?
If you've been following any of the legislation, and I'm positive you have been, people and consumers are so particular and so aware of how companies are tracking them and gathering their data. And they're recognizing that they don't have all of the information about how that data is being used. And without that, and articulated in a very clear way by the company that's tracking, people are just inherently really hesitant to agree to that. How many times have you gotten that alert on your phone? Like, hey, we want to track what you're doing. Are you okay with that? Like, no.
Right.
Who says yes? I don't know. Actually, I would love to understand more about people who say yes to that question.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's not me. And I recognize that, there are people that are very different than I am. And so it would be actually a fascinating research study to better understand that. But the reality is that when you are sort of engaging with your customers and trying to understand their behaviors and how they're engaging with you, companies really start to have to rely more on this level of opt-in feedback and this notion that it's not that customers don't want to provide their feedback, right? It's just that they don't want to be tracked in a way that they truly don't understand, what the company is actually doing with their data. And so we talk to many consumers who are more than willing to provide feedback to companies in a way where they get to sort of decide how they want to show up. They get to decide what information that they want to share. And that is truly about making that authentic human to human connection with a consumer. You're going to get much richer data than, just sort of tracking the people who allow you to track them, which is likely a very small percentage of your customer base, right? And then you get to the question of like, okay, so we're only getting data from people who have agreed to be tracked. What are we missing? You're not getting the whole picture because there's this whole big chunk of people that have decided not to let you do that. And so you know very little about them and their behavior. And so that's why this type of work is so important, because it gives you that fuller perspective.
Now, I want to shift a little bit to kind of to you, Janelle. It seems like your dance with customer experience started, at least on paper, when you were at Forrester. You ended up at Nielsen and spent almost a decade there. So what was it that kind of led you, to dive into CX in the early days?
Sure. So it was at Forrester. So when I graduated from Bentley University, which was Bentley College at the time, it's a business-focused school. They're, accounting, finance, economics, the big four comes and recruits, people graduating, their senior year. I didn't graduate with a business degree. I intended to, but it didn't quite happen that way. I had a degree in information design and corporate communication, and I could not find a job when I graduated because there weren't jobs in UX and customer experience at the time, which was sort of like that program was sort of like one of the early programs that was sort of centered around this. That being said, I landed at Forrester. It's not in my resume. I probably should actually add it because I just put in the last role I had there. But the very first role I had, which I was in for a year, was customer service specialist. So I would be answering the phone for people who were having trouble logging into the website. Yeah, couldn't find an article they're looking for. It's not a cheap subscription to be a Forrester customer. And so, fielding all of those questions and concerns and frustrations. And I remember there was a woman who ran the website, and she would take me out to lunch on a monthly basis. And this was like before you didn't have systems that tracked all the things that people were calling in about. It was like very early days of data. But she used to take me out to lunch every month, and she'd ask me so what are people calling about? What do you hear? Basically asking for trends and what she's hearing about and using that information to create a better website experience for customers. And there was something about that experience that really stood out to me. It's sort of oh, this is so interesting. You can take this feedback and you can address it, and then it's fixed at scale, right? It makes my life easier too, because I don't have to keep answering the same question over and over again. And so that was really sort of my understanding of in early days of what really piqued my interest. After that, I went back to grad school in a program that's sort of like the intersection between how the mind works and design. So how do you create experiences that are built to optimize sort of the strengths of how the mind works and also minimize some of the challenges that you have when processing information? It was fascinating world.
Wow.
Of everything from how you process information, like this idea of pre-attentive processing, which is all the stuff that happens subconsciously before you're even aware that you're processing anything, to how you make decisions, to how you retain information. It is speaking of geeking out, it is a fascinating world.
That's amazing. What's something wise that mentors taught you about CX?
It's so interesting having gone through this evolution of being in this space, because when I first started, it was all about truly understanding people right? And understanding and advocating for your customers at a very human level and saying, hey, this is like really hard for people to do. We should be doing something about this because it's causing confusion, or it's, making it more stressful than it needs to be. And it was sort of like any opportunity that you saw to make the experience better was something that you were recommending would happen, right? If you're in a role where you're capturing this feedback, like how do you feed that back into the teams that can actually go and address it? And I think I've learned over time that you really have to be intentional about the feedback and where you're advocating in order to be sort of successful in this role. Because the reality is, like, there is no shortage of issues with every experience. Like, no design and no experience will ever be perfect. But when you are collecting this feedback, how do you then make your suggestions back to the teams in a way where you can tie that to some sort of impact, right? Because it's somewhat of a reality, right? Is that although companies strive to be customer centric and they value customer experience and see it as a key differentiator, the reality is they are really looking to invest in things and make changes to things that will essentially help them as a business. And so being very smart about what you tie yourself to, I think it's really easy for somebody in this space, myself included, to just be so fascinated by so many different things. And there's no shortage of questions to go chase down and answer. But to be effective in this role, you have to actually figure out, okay, what are those key experiences? Where are the places where we really need to optimize the experience for the business to perform? And that's where I want to tie myself to, and what I want to sort of, that's how I'm effective in a role like this. And so, I don't know, it's been a little bit of a sad reality in a way where, like, you almost have to think about your work that way. Like, it's like when I first got into this field, it was sort of like, oh my gosh, this is, like this really cool area that can have massive impact on, customers at scale if we do this the right way. I mean, the AAA example is a perfect example of why this work is so important. But again, the reality is, like, you can't fix everything. You've got to pick and choose. And the way that you prioritize is through what the business kind of cares about. And that's been a key lesson for me in this journey.
So it seems like you would be someone that I would want to pull into an argument between sales and marketing. Do you feel like you have perspective? Like, do you get brought into these conversations at a leadership level of like sales and marketing?
It's interesting when you think about sales and marketing and actually beyond, right? Acquisition and getting people on board and things like that. It's a customer journey. Like, it is, like, from the customer's perspective, it is one seamless experience. They don't care if marketing owns it. They don't care if sales owns it. They don't care if support owns it. It's like, this is you. This is kind of your brand. And so being able to shape that and taking that outside in perspective and sharing that with teams, sales leaders, marketing leaders, other leaders in the company, to see, hey, we're thinking about our business this way. And like, it's almost like, when a customer has a bumpy experience with you, it's almost like they can see that it's so clear to them, and that it's, it's a disjointed experience and it's frustrating, right? But it's like, again, they're expecting a single seamless experience from your company. And so providing that perspective, like, hey, here's how your customers are, how their brand perception is being shaped by you and the marketing programs that you have in place. And then once they engage with us from a sales perspective, and I'm thinking B2B, but I mean, B2C is the same way, where it's sort of like, okay, so I have this expectation of who you are. And then when I get to your experience, I'm expecting a certain thing. And if it falls down, it's your opportunity to lose the customer. And so I guess the most influential, or how I've been most influential in those conversations, is actually showing leaders, like, hey, this is what our customers are experiencing when they engage with us over time, all the times we touch them through marketing campaigns. And then here's what happens when they actually come to us to engage with us, in a deal, or they want to convert to be a customer, and the inconsistencies between them, and help people prioritize and address those.
What would you say is like one skill that you've cultivated in your career that really continues to benefit you and those around you?
Storytelling, hands down. And this work that we do where we bring customers to life, I mean, we call the little videos that we produce of people engaging with an experience where you can hear what they're saying and you can watch what they're doing and, see sort of the whole thing happening from the customer's perspectives. We call them customer experience narratives because those are stories. Those are stories that people can connect to. And when you watch a video of somebody struggling, that sticks with you much longer than looking at a pie chart or a graph on a slide somewhere. And so and being able to tell those stories, advocate for your customers using those stories. I mean, there's a ton of research that shows, how people retain information, and that storytelling is way more effective than other means of communicating information. I would think that skill has served me very well in my career, telling stories.
What do you consider, the biggest challenge for CMOs and marketing leaders these days? What would you say is one of the biggest challenge for CMOs and marketing leaders these days?
Yeah, if you would have asked me this a couple of years ago, I might have had a different answer. But I today, I think it's all about keeping up with the shifting needs and expectations that your customers have and expect from you as a brand and company. I mean, we look at some of the work if you just imagine the world in the last couple of years between COVID, between some of the racial injustice that's happened to now the issues in Ukraine and Russia. I mean, there is no shortage of opportunities for companies to share their positioning, take action on some of these initiatives. But it has to be done in a thoughtful way that people can sort of connect to and needs to feel authentic and be authentic, right? You also have to carry through with what your message is. And so I think that's a big part of the challenge of, leading a brand and leading the messaging around it is sort of like, how do we show up around those issues? Because if you look at some of the recent data, I mean, people are choosing the companies that they want to engage with based on how they are reacting to some of these major societal issues. And so that's one piece. And I mean, that's just one sliver of customer expectations, right? There's the broader landscape of like, how do I even want to engage with you? Do I want to engage with you on my mobile app or on my mobile phone? Do I want to have, a cohesive experience across multiple channels and touch points? I mean, yeah, the answer is yes to that question. But I mean, the reality is that especially with the last couple of years and all the changes that are happened around us and continue to happen, is that you've got to keep a pulse on what your customers want, what they need, what they expect from you as a brand and a company. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to do that when you're just looking at lagging indicators. You've got to get out in front of that.
In terms of just buying behavior, is there any surprising things that even surprised you in the past year?
Yeah, the e-commerce one's fascinating to me and one that I'm like kind of keeping a pulse on myself, right? So when we first entered the COVID era, e-commerce has been accelerating for some time. And it's sort of like that we were talking about earlier, that predictable model of every year it gets like a little, the e-commerce purchasing behavior gets a little bit more active, if you will. But then when you introduce COVID, it was sort of like, I think it was like 5 years acceleration in like 1 year, right? And so that did not actually surprise me. I think what continues to surprise me a bit is that people are continuing with a lot of that same COVID behavior. It's like, they've adopted these new ways to engage with companies. An example of this is, buy online, pick up in store, or buy online, curbside. A lot of people adopted that during COVID and continue to use it now because they've developed these habits and patterns and sort of it's a way of life now. I guess I wasn't really expecting that. I was kind of thinking, once the world settled down and things where people would feel more comfortable going into stores, that they might go back to the old way of doing things. But that actually hasn't been the case. And so that one's interesting to me. I mean, I understand why, right? I mean, personal experience, I started using buy online, pick up curbside, and I'm never going back inside of the store if I don't have to. So I get it. I was thinking even sort of like, that behavior spanned like every generation. And so I was thinking maybe some generations or pockets of demographics would kind of go back to the old way, but it's fascinating. Humans are fascinating beings.
Indeed. Indeed. Do you have any thoughts on NFTs and the metaverse and if they could be strategic for brands? Are you getting pulled into these conversations? And if so, I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on that.
Yeah, we have a ton of customers right now that are actually trying to figure out, how do we actually show up in the metaverse? Do we show up in the metaverse? And so this goes back to customer expectations and needs. Are you showing up in the metaverse because your top competitor is, or because, some executive thinks it's a good idea, or are you showing up because your customers actually expect you to be there and that you can provide a specific value in that forum? And I think, that is a big piece of this whole new world, right? It's understanding. And honestly, people aren't going to be able to tell you at this point because most people aren't in the metaverse. And so it's early days. But when we think about the development and evolution of the space and we start to try to figure out, is this the right place for us to invest our presence? Again, going back to what customers expect and want from you. Now, once you're actually in the metaverse, of course, you can get feedback on what the experience is actually like and how you can optimize it. But I think the big piece that companies are grappling with right now is like, is this a thing that we need to be doing? I mean, certainly we're paying attention to it, but how do we decide if and when we want to show up?
Janelle, is there anything else that you're like, oh, I want to make sure we touch on this before we shift?
One other thing that I think is super interesting for people to know is that there's this disconnect between what executives are saying about the importance of customer experience and then what's actually happening within teams and how to like bridge that gap. So basically the long and short of it is that executives are like, yes, we're investing in customer experience. It's a key differentiator for us. But then when you go talk to people who are actually building the experience, like they're not pulling any of this in to their process. And so I don't really have an answer for it. I just think it's a super interesting conundrum.
Okay. This podcast is brought to you by Salesforce. We're grateful for Salesforce. And when marketers and marketing leaders think about marketing and engagement, Salesforce is certainly a leader in that space. If you want to learn more, head over to salesforce.com/marketing. We've got Janelle Estes, Chief Insights Officer at UserTesting. First question is a doozy, Janelle. Texting or talking?
Texting.
What's one thing that you love and appreciate about yourself?
What I love and respect about myself is my ability to sort of be good at a lot of different things, but also know the priority of those things, if that makes sense. So,
like that.
like everyone else, we have jobs and careers and families and other things that we're involved in. Being able to have perspective on all of that, I think is something that I am thankful that I have.
That's great. What's your favorite day of the week?
Ooh, good one. I do love Wednesday. There's something about Wednesday, sort of like over the hump and, the weekend's upon you, that type of thing.
What's your favorite city in the US besides the one you live in?
It's the one I visit all the time, which is San Francisco. There's something about that city and that area of the world that puts a little pep in your step. And it's very different from where I live, which is in Maine.
Okay. Would you rather be able to speak every language in the world or be able to talk to animals?
My daughter would say talk to animals for sure. She would want me to have that skill. But I think the language one is really interesting too. I mean, I guess if I had to choose for myself, it would be the language.
Okay.
And just ability to communicate with anyone.
I love it. What's your favorite holiday?
I would say my favorite holiday is probably 4th of July. Just being in Maine in the Northeast is sort of like the height of summer and a lot of fun things to do outside with family and friends and not a lot of pressure like some of the other holidays we might have.
You're the first one that said that holiday, so I'm glad you took a minute for that one. That's good. Please finish the sentence for me. Something wise my elders taught me was?
To stay true to yourself.
Would you rather have invisibility or super strength?
Ooh, definitely invisibility.
Okay. Is it wrong for a vegetarian to eat animal crackers?
No.
Okay. If you weren't in customer experience, what would you be doing?
Before I moved into customer experience, I actually explored a career more in the healthcare side of things. And I think there's something there about empathy and taking care of people and making sure that needs are being met, right? It's sort of like weirdly parallel to what I'm focused on now.
Okay. Last question. If you could go back and whisper in the ear of your younger self about being a leader and being a leader in the world that you're in now in customer experience, what would you tell yourself?
Your perspective is powerful and unique.
Love that answer. Cool. This is awesome. Janelle, right at the top of the hour, thank you so much for being here. This was, for me, an incredible way to start my day. You got the wheels turning, and I'm thinking, man, I hope a bunch of our CMOs that listen will tune into this exceptional episode. Thanks for being here. You were incredible.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Thanks again to Salesforce for making this show possible. To learn more, head over to salesforce.com/marketing.